I flew home for my grandpa's 80th birthday. What I found. No guests, no celebration. Just him alone in a wheelchair. And a note saying someone took $20,000. But that was just the beginning. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, someone's fake legacy will fall apart live in front of everyone. You know that feeling when you return home expecting warmth, but instead, you walk into silence that feels rehearsed. That's what hit me the moment I stepped into my childhood house. No decorations, no laughter, just a collapsing cake, an empty chair, and a silence that screamed betrayal. But what I found in the days that followed, a hidden will, a forged signature, and a fake family legacy, changed everything. This isn't just a story about $20,000, it's about how far some people will go to erase you and what happens when you quietly, powerfully refuse to disappear. I hadn't seen snow in 4 years. Not real snow, the kind that clings to your boots and stings your nose. Not the thin, desperate flurries they spray from machines outside malls in Florida. But here, back in Wisconsin, it dusted the windshield as I pulled into the driveway of the house I used to call home. The air bit through my coat. Maple leaves skittered across the concrete like they were fleeing something, and maybe I should have taken the hint. The house looked the same. Same beige siding, same uneven step to the porch, but it didn't feel the same. Something about the stillness felt staged. In the passenger seat sat a small bouquet of white carnations. Grandpa's favorite, and a thick wool shawl I'd picked up from a local artisan market in Tampa. He always complained his shoulders got cold in October. I'd remembered. I always did. The screen door creaked under my hand, and I half expected the scent of coffee or someone calling from the kitchen. Instead, I was greeted by silence and the faint scent of lemon polish over something older, staler. The air had that quiet that doesn't just mean empty, it means abandoned. Grandpa, I called out. No answer. The living room was untouched. A bag of party hats sat unopened on the table, the kind with tiny elastic straps and metallic fringe. A single balloon, half deflated, drooped sadly from a corner of the ceiling. Scotch tape held it in place like a reluctant decoration at a party. No one showed up for. I found him in the kitchen facing the window, his wheelchair parked inches from the sink. His hands rested on the armrests, fingers pale and trembling. On the counter behind him sat a chocolate cake with blue icing. It had started to collapse on one side like it was giving up. He turned his head slowly. His eyes were glassy but lit up when they found mine. "Elle," he said, soft and surprised. "You came." I knelt beside him, placed the shawl over his lap. He reached down and touched it with reverence. "They said you weren't." "Who said that?" I asked, though I already knew. "They all did," he murmured. "Said you had work. Said it was complicated." Complicated. That word again. My throat tightened. I stood to move toward the fridge. That's when I saw the note taped there hastily with the same kind of scotch tape used for the balloon. Borrowed $20K from joint account. Will return. M. Just like that. No apology. No explanation. Not even my name. Just a withdrawal notice, like she was picking up eggs. My jaw locked. That account wasn't just money, it was responsibility, shared between Melanie, Brandon, and me to cover Grandpa's care. I had receipts, contributions, quarterly deposits. And now it was empty. "They had errands," Grandpa said again, quieter this time. Said they'd be back. I turned back to him. When he blinked slowly. They didn't say. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Reflexively, I reached for it. No new messages, no missed calls. Not from Melanie, not from Mom, not even a group chat. Ping. And then just as I went to slide it back into my pocket, a new text came through. From Mom. "Please don't come to the house again. Let things be. M. No punctuation, no warmth." I looked around. No chairs set out, no plates, no half-eaten cake slices, not even a fork in the sink. This hadn't been a party. This had been abandonment dressed up as delay. I opened the cupboards, found 2 chipped mugs, boiled water, and made tea. Set the cake in front of us and sliced it carefully, even though it leaned like a tired soldier. The icing stuck to the knife like melted regret. He sipped slowly. "They said you'd moved on," he said. I smiled. "I never moved away from you." He didn't respond right away, just looked down at the cake slice like it might answer for everyone else's silence. I remembered his 72nd birthday. The last time I was invited. There were lasagnas and cousins and a messy kitchen filled with off-key singing. Back then he'd laughed when I forgot the candles, swatting me with a napkin and saying, "You remembered me. That's enough." Now even the frosting was sinking. As we sat, I noticed the photo wall in the hallway. Portraits of Melanie's family posed on beaches in matching holiday sweaters, graduation gowns, ski trips, not a single photo of me. Not even the one we took at his last doctor's visit. The one where he'd smiled through the anesthesia fog and gripped my hand like a lifeline. I hadn't been forgotten. I'd been edited out. This wasn't neglect. It was deliberate. I logged into the account, I said after a while. He nodded, slow and resigned. "They didn't ask me," I added. "No," he said. "They never do." We sipped our tea. Outside, the wind picked up scattering red and gold leaves across the porch like confetti from a party that never happened. I looked at the empty chair across from me, the one meant for guests who never arrived. I looked at Grandpa wrapped in the shawl. I brought his hands fragile but still reaching. And in that moment, I realized the most painful erasure isn't when people forget you existed. It's when they remember and choose to pretend you never mattered. The birthday cake was chocolate pink frosting. Piped roses, silver candles. It should have been perfect, except my name was wrong. Not Eleanor, not Elle, not even close. "Elena," I'd asked. Staring at the frosted letters, Melanie laughed like it was no big deal. "It's just a cake," she said. "Don't be so serious, Elle." But I was 16 and I'd always been serious, especially about being seen. Mom clapped, already cutting slices. Dad handed me a card that had $20 inside. Grandpa winked and handed me a bookmark he said he found at a thrift shop. Everyone smiled. Everyone laughed, but no one corrected the name. No one saw how I smiled with my mouth and swallowed my disappointment. Whole. Later, Melanie got a used Jetta with a bow. Dad was beaming. "You earned this." Mel, she had a C+ average and 3 detentions. I had a scholarship application already drafted and a trophy for statewide essay competition in my bag, but all I got was a lopsided cake and the promise. "Maybe next year, sweetie." That year wasn't an exception. It was the pattern. I never got scolded, never got screamed at. That would have made me real. No, what I got was something quieter, more permanent. The polite kind of erasure that only families truly perfect. At Thanksgiving, I was cropped out of a photo where my arm had been around Grandpa's shoulder. Recognized the tablecloth, the mismatched chairs I'd taken that picture myself. Set the timer, ran to the corner, squeezed in. Last second. The version on the wall had been edited. Tighter. Frame cleaner composition. No L. Just a vase behind where I'd stood. And the worst part, no one mentioned it. Not once, not oops, not. We didn't realize. It was as if I'd never been there to begin with. I found an old scrapbook in the guest room one summer when I was 19. Grandma's last birthday. Everyone was there. Everyone but me. I flipped page after page, the ache growing sharper, then tucked in the corner of a page, a single candid shot. Me in the background, clearing plates, my back to the camera. Out of focus, head cut off by the border of another photo. They didn't forget me. They just didn't think I needed to be remembered, and that realization, it lands slower than anger. It sinks in like cold. It's one thing to be left out of an event. It's another to be left out of the story. There was a moment in high school I remember better than most. I won a statewide writing award. Hundreds of applicants, only 5 winners. I was one of them. I brought the certificate home, beaming. Melanie glanced at it, said cool, and went back to her phone. Mom barely looked up from folding laundry. "Don't gloat," she said without irony. "It's just a school thing." The same week, Melanie got best hair in the yearbook. They framed it and hung it by the front door. I remember standing beneath it once in silence, my award tucked inside a drawer upstairs collecting dust. When I asked why no one ever came to my ceremonies, Mom said, "You're too intense." Let things go. Let things go. I carried that phrase in my mouth for years like a bitter candy I couldn't swallow. Standing now in Grandpa's hallway, I saw the photos again. Melanie with her baby Melanie on vacation, Melanie at prom, Brandon and his kids playing in the snow. And then I saw it. The cookout photo. I remembered setting up the tripod, adjusting the frame, getting Grandpa to sit up straighter. I'd taken the picture, I knew exactly where I stood. In the framed version, I wasn't there, just open air where I had leaned in. The hedge behind me looked oddly perfect, like it had always been empty. I leaned closer. A tiny blur, maybe a hand, maybe the corner of my dress. Pressed my fingers to the frame and stared. That photo used to be whole. Someone had cropped it. I could feel the breath leave my lungs like a slow deflation. They didn't forget to include me. They removed me. And that difference, intent versus accident, cut deeper than anything else. Behind me, Grandpa wheeled softly into view. "They never liked that one," he said, voice low, because I was in it. He didn't answer directly. Said it was too crowded. Too much going on. I turned. "But you remember it." He nodded. "You brought lemon bars. Mel burned the burgers. You made the kids pick up their juice boxes. You always saw the things other people missed." I blinked fast. The warmth of his voice caught me off guard. "You were there," he said gently. "I remember." That was the thing about this kind of erasure. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It chips away slowly until you start believing maybe you were never meant to be there at all. But memory, real memory, holds on. It doesn't need perfect pictures, it needs truth. "I don't think they want the truth," I said quietly. "No," Grandpa agreed. "But I do." We stood there together. Me and the only person who'd ever made me feel like I wasn't invisible in this house. And in that moment, even with all the years of quiet deletion behind me, I felt something spark. Maybe I couldn't go back and rewrite the story they told, but I could start writing my own. The joint care account was empty. I stared at the screen numb. The balance was 0. No pending deposits, no transfers. Just silence, digital clinical silence where there should have been the security of Grandpa's next month of medication, nurse visits, wheelchair maintenance. I had opened that account with Melanie 3 years ago when Grandpa's falls started happening more frequently. I was in Tampa then, working full-time, but I offered to cover half the costs. Melanie said she'd manage the bills if I handled the money. It sounded fair. It sounded like family. I had set up auto debits, quarterly transfers, tracked receipts. They promised to match me. I should have known better. The final withdrawal had been made last week. $20,000, moved in one clean sweep to an external account ending in 44. Melanie's number. I felt the back of my throat burn. My stomach tightened. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal, it was the predictability of it. Before I could even let the full weight settle in, my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. "Melanie Bundy tagged you in a post." I tapped it with a sick feeling in my gut. It opened to an album titled "A Day to Remember Grandpa's 80th 27 Photos," all uploaded 2 days ago. 2 days ago, the exact date I found Grandpa alone in his wheelchair whispering that they'd gone out to run errands. In the album, Melanie beamed in a coral dress, Brandon wore a navy blazer, and behind them, draped proudly across the event hall wall, was a vinyl banner printed with Grandpa's smiling face and the words "Celebrating a Legacy." He wasn't even there. They threw him a party without him? No, not even that. They threw themselves a party about him without his presence and without his knowledge, and certainly without mine. Cupcakes, pastel decorations, sponsored floral arrangements. There were photos of cousins, colleagues, even a local council member who apparently gave a small speech about the strength of caregiving in America. Under one shot of Brandon holding a glass of punch to the man who raised us right. Couldn't have done this without Melanie and Brandon. Family first caregivers of the year. My fingers clenched around the phone. The comments were worse. Wow, such devotion. You guys are angels. He's lucky to have you. I wanted to scream. To post the truth. To upload the photo I took just hours ago. Grandpa asleep in his chair under a frayed blanket cake, half melted beside him, alone. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I made my way back to his room. His breath was soft and rhythmic from the recliner, face twitching gently in his sleep. I tried not to disturb him as I moved to the dresser to the top drawer he'd told me earlier that morning. There's something in there meant to give it to you a while back. I pulled out a box soft at the corners like it had been opened and closed too many times. Inside were photos black and white, curled at the edges. My kindergarten drawing of us together, to Grampy spelled with a backward Y. And under it all, folded carefully, was a document. A property trust draft. Grandpa's name. My name. Eleanor Grace. Hartley listed co-owner contingent beneficiary of the house, signed, but not witnessed. No stamp, but real. I sat on the bed and let the warmth of that paper sink into my skin. I mattered to him legally. Not just in passing conversation or holiday phone calls, on paper. And then I saw the second document. The updated draft. This time no, Eleanor. No L. Just Brandon and Melanie. Same terms, same date, different world. They hadn't revised it to add their names. They had rewritten it to remove mine. No red marks, no explanations, no track changes. Just clean deletion. As if I'd never been there at all, I felt the familiar weight of grief mix with a newer, colder ache. They weren't just keeping me out of party photos. They weren't just forgetting to include me in group messages. They were stripping me from the record, from the legal trail, from the legacy. My heart pounded as I gathered both documents and slipped them into my bag. The old lamp beside his bed flickered softly. Everything in this house bore signs of someone who had been gently abandoned, repackaged as cared for only when the cameras were on. I walked back to the kitchen in silence. The house creaked. Outside, the October leaves shivered in the wind. Inside, everything felt like it was holding its breath. And then, I noticed something else. Taped to the fridge was the same note I had seen earlier, but I looked closer now. The handwriting wasn't just rushed. It was cold. Borrowed $20,000 from joint account. Will return M. No. Dear L. No. Love, your sister. No explanation. No shame. I stared at it for a long time, then took out my phone and snapped a photo, then another close-up time-stamped documented. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was evidence. For a moment, I placed my hand flat against the fridge. Its metal was cold beneath my palm, cold and solid and steady. And in that quiet kitchen surrounded by echoes of silence, I whispered something I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud in years. They didn't just want me quiet, they wanted me gone. But I wasn't. I was still here, still breathing, still remembering, still ready. The knock came just after 10 p.m., soft, almost apologetic. The kind of knock that hopes you're too tired to answer. But I wasn't. I'd just finished folding the last of Grandpa's laundry. The house was still except for the faint crackle of the old jazz station playing from the den. Grandpa had fallen asleep in his recliner after I massaged his knees with lavender balm the way I used to when I visited over Christmas breaks. The knock came again. 3 light taps, like Morse code. For I shouldn't be here. I moved toward the door, cautious. Through the side window I saw the silhouette hoodie-up hands deep in pockets pacing nervously. It was Gavin, 17. Melanie's only son. He looked like he had run here, not because he was in danger, but because if he stopped walking, he might have lost the nerve. Gavin, I asked as I opened the door halfway. Does your mom know you're here? His head shook so fast it was almost a flinch. No. Please. Just for a minute. I opened the door fully and stepped aside. Of course. He slipped past me like a shadow and stood in the middle of the living room, unsure of whether to sit or bolt. His breath fogged the air slightly, and I noticed he was shivering, whether from cold or adrenaline I couldn't tell. Tea. I offered gently. He nodded but didn't touch the cup once I set it down. We sat in silence for a few moments. I watched him fiddle with the frayed hem of his sleeve. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. She told me to block you last year. Melanie. He nodded. Said you were manipulative, that you were trying to take Grandpa away from the family. I didn't flinch. That sounds like her. I believed her, he said, eyes still down. But then today after that party they were in the car talking I wasn't supposed to hear. He pulled out his phone and unlocked it. His thumb hesitated over the gallery. Then he turned the screen toward me. A screenshot. A group chat I recognized. Melanie's display picture immediately. Let her keep playing nursemaid. When he's gone, we'll handle it. Then Brandon, she'll burn herself out, trying to play savior. Let her. And finally Melanie again. The longer she thinks she matters, the easier it'll be to erase. I blinked hard. I'd imagined things like this, suspected it, but seeing it written so casually like a grocery list broke something. I didn't realize I'd still been holding together. They were laughing, Gavin said, like you were stupid, like Grandpa was a prop. I looked at him, then really looked. He was pale, eyes rimmed red, his loyalty had been shattered, and what sat across from me wasn't just a teenager. It was someone standing in the ash of a story he no longer believed in. You didn't have to come here, I said quietly. I did, he replied, because it's wrong, and because I saw the way he looked at you when you gave him that new shawl. It wasn't pity, it was peace. I swallowed against the ache in my throat. He's the only person who ever made me feel like I belonged. Gavin nodded. He talks about you sometimes. When he forgets other names, he remembers yours. That hit harder than any of the betrayal had. He pulled another screenshot from his phone, this one an email draft, addressed to Brandon's subject line. POA transfer recommendation. Uncle Brandon has been trying to make Mom get Grandpa to sign new papers, Gavin said. To make it look like you were never part of anything. They don't even think he understands what he's signing anymore. I closed my eyes for a second, then opened them slowly. Thank you for telling me. You believe me, Gavin. I believe you more than I believe half the people I share a bloodline with. He smiled, then shy, but there. Before he left, he looked down at his hands and said, If you ever need me to say this somewhere official, I will. I don't want to be part of the lie. You already aren't, I said. Then he hesitated halfway out the door. I know I'm just a kid, but sometimes the only way to stop a cycle is to break it from the inside. I nodded. Sometimes the youngest person in the room is the only one who sees clearly. He left into the dark, his figure swallowed up by falling leaves and street lamp shadows. I stood for a long time in the hallway holding the empty mug. The house was quiet again, but not the kind of silence that haunted, the kind that listened. Gavin was the crack in the dam, the proof that truth still had a way through even in a family that had mastered the art of silence. He was the person I hadn't known I was waiting for, the story no one expected, and the beginning of the end for them. They called it a family conversation. Melanie sent the message in her usual saccharine tone. Hey, Elle, we thought it might be good to sit down and clear the air. Just us, no drama. Let's talk like grown-ups, okay? It reeked of strategy, not reconciliation. Still, I said yes, not because I believed them, because I knew what they didn't. This time I had the truth in my hands and I wasn't afraid to use it. The meeting was held in Brandon's sunroom, naturally lit, flawlessly curated. Lemon water in mason jars, a stack of lavender-scented tissues placed artfully on the coffee table. There were throw pillows that said things like "Grace and Family First" stitched in soft gray thread. Melanie greeted me at the door like a hostess auditioning for a talk show. Elle, she smiled. teeth too bright. You look rested, I said. Nothing. Brandon motioned to a single chair slightly separated from the rest. The defendant's seat. I took it, placed my leather folio flat on my lap, and waited. Melanie launched in quickly like a lawyer in an opening statement. We're here because we're concerned, she began. Your behavior lately has raised some flags. You've been combative, distant, distrustful. Brandon picked up the thread seamlessly. We just want to protect Dad and his legacy and make sure things are handled responsibly. When the time comes. Handled, I repeated, like overdrawing a joint care account. They both ignored me. Instead, Melanie reached into a folder and pulled out a 5-page document. This is a voluntary relinquishment of inheritance and claim, she said, like she was offering me tea. It just clarifies that you don't intend to pursue legal stake in Grandpa's estate. Given your distance, distance. She didn't blink. You've been in Florida for years because no one told me the real dates of anything. That's not how we remember it. Of course it's not, I said quietly. You edit memory like you edit photos. She placed the document in front of me. At the top, non-contest waiver, family property and care provisions. Clause 1. I waive all right to contest any future estate decisions. Clause 2. I forfeit any claim to real estate assets or care-related reimbursements. Clause 3. I agree to hold no legal authority over medical or financial affairs. I laughed. Just once, it echoed more than I expected. Then Melanie stood and turned on the mounted screen. Let's remember who really showed up. A slideshow began. Images flashed across the wall. Melanie feeding Grandpa soup. Brandon walking him in a wheelchair. Gavin placing a party hat gently on his head, all heavily filtered, all carefully framed. Then came photos of me at a conference, me on a beach, me hugging a friend at a gala. She chose her career. Melanie narrated smoothly. She was gone during the hardest times. They expected me to shrink, to sputter, to explain myself. Instead, I calmly unzipped my folio. My turn, I said. I pulled out printed emails, dated text messages, bank screenshots. I handed them one by one. An email from me begging for updates. No reply. A forwarded invoice. I paid for Grandpa's medication, a flight receipt from 2 birthdays ago when they told me the party had been postponed only to host it without me. Then I pulled out the final page. A USB drive, this, I said, plugging it into Brandon's laptop is something you didn't edit. A moment of hesitation. Then a voice filled the room. Worn, honest, gentle. Grandpa. The recording flickered onto the screen. He was sitting in his recliner, son on his shoulder wrapped in the shawl I'd given him, his eyes clear for the briefest window of clarity. I know they think. I don't see what's happening, he said, voice trembling but strong. But I do. He looked straight into the camera. Elle has been the only one who didn't need a photo to prove she loved me. She didn't need praise. She just came, over and over again. A pause. When I'm gone, I want her to have the house, the money, the books, the porch, swing. Everything. He smiled faintly. She's the only one who made this house feel like home again. Silence, real silence. No music, no script, just the raw sound of love finally given a voice. Melanie stood frozen. Brandon's mouth was slightly open. Their eyes darted from the screen to me and back again, searching for something they could discredit. You manipulated him, Brandon said flatly. No, I said. You ignored him. I pulled the USB and held it in my palm like a dagger. I came because you thought I had no proof, no power. But I do. I have both. They said nothing. So I stood, and for the first time I walked out, not angry, not defeated, not wounded. I walked out as the one who knew where the truth lived and who no longer needed their permission to carry it. You would think that after a recorded statement from their father naming me as his heir, they'd stop. They didn't. It was a Thursday morning just after I had finished helping Grandpa with breakfast when I saw the envelope wedged into the mailbox. It had no return address, just one word typed on the front: finalization. Inside was a photocopy of a quitclaim deed, the kind used to transfer property quickly without guarantees. At the bottom was a shaky, inconsistent signature under Grandpa's name. Stamped, dated, notarized, supposedly, except the signature looked nothing like his. I knew because I had helped him sign every birthday card for the past 3 years, and the notary listed. I looked her up. She'd notarized Melanie's salon lease last spring. Of course she had. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table and placed the document in front of Grandpa. He squinted, leaning closer. "I don't remember signing this," he said. "They had me scribble on a few things, said it was about my prescriptions." My chest tightened. "You think they tricked you?" "I don't think, Elle." He said, his voice steadier than it had been in days. "I know." That night I called someone I hadn't spoken to in over 5 years. Harold Stein, Grandpa's original estate attorney. I remembered him from when I was 13, and Grandpa had updated his will after Grandma died. He had thick glasses and a sharp sense of humor. And he never liked Melanie. "I was wondering when someone would call me about this circus," he said after I introduced myself. "I still have the original trust documents. You do?" "Of course. And more importantly, I have a notarized amendment." Grandpa signed before his cognition declined. "It names you sole heir. Dated, witnessed, filed, legally airtight." I exhaled slowly. "Can you send me a copy? I'll do one better. I'll come up next week and bring a witness. I don't like people who exploit the elderly." The next day, I scheduled a formal verification meeting. But not just with Harold. I invited Susan Cross, a certified notary, and a court clerk from Dane County. I told her to bring her badge. We met in Grandpa's living room. Grandpa was seated upright, his eyes clearer than usual. Beside me sat Harold, briefcase in lap. The court clerk sat silently to the side with a small recorder. Right on time, the front door burst open. Melanie walked in, hair curled, makeup. Perfect. Brandon followed with a coffee in hand, smiling like this was a brunch reservation. "What's going on?" Melanie asked, her tone already defensive. "We're verifying a legal document," I said simply. Brandon snorted. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Harold didn't flinch. He pulled out the trust amendment and laid it on the coffee table. "This is the legally binding copy of Mr. Robert Hartley's estate designation," he said, "including his medical power of attorney and property assignment." Melanie scoffed. He was confused when he signed that. Harold raised an eyebrow. "This was filed 8 months before any diagnosis." Brandon stepped forward, voice rising. "We already submitted paperwork. The house is transferred." "That's done." The court clerk stood, then silent until now. "About that," she said calmly. "I reviewed the notary stamp on the deed transfer. It's invalid. That notary's license expired 2 years ago." Melanie froze. Brandon blinked. "She notarized our salon lease, which may now also be void." The clerk added, typing a note. Silence. Then Melanie's voice cracked. He said I could have the house. He told me he didn't want Elle involved. I looked at Grandpa. He blinked slowly, then whispered, "I don't remember saying that." Melanie's jaw clenched. "You manipulated him," she hissed at me. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. Harold tapped the trust amendment. Mr. Hartley signed this voluntarily, witnessed by 2 legal parties. Your document, by contrast, was filed through a notary who we discovered has been cited for 3 ethics violations. Brandon's voice was suddenly much quieter. This feels dramatic. I stood up then, slowly, silently, and walked to the bookshelf near the fireplace. There, taped inside the cover of Grandpa's old woodworking journal, was the video recording Gavin had helped me back up Grandpa, speaking candidly about his estate, naming dates, intentions, and most powerfully, love. I placed it on the table. "This was taken 2 weeks before your forged document. He's lucid, he's clear, he's intentional." Melanie looked between the video and the notary. "You set us up." "No," I said finally. You set yourself up, I just recorded it. Brandon raised his hands, muttering something about needing to call his attorney, but I knew the look in his eyes. This was no longer a performance, it was exposure, and it was quiet. There were no raised voices, no shouting, just the long, suffocating silence that happens when people realize their version of the story won't hold. The clerk nodded, packed up her notes, and said softly to me, "Well done." I walked them to the door. As they left, Grandpa reached for my hand. "Elle," he whispered. "You didn't scream." "No," I said, "because I didn't need to." I looked out the window, watching Melanie's car peel down the drive. Her taillights disappeared behind the trees. And for the first time in this whole ordeal, I didn't feel shaken. I felt still, like the truth had finally settled into its rightful place. I didn't reclaim the lake house to prove a point. I did it because Grandpa once stood barefoot on its dock, looked out across the water, and whispered, "One day I'd like to build a place here, where people who gave too much could finally breathe." I remembered that, and so I built it. The papers had been signed, the deed was mine, and yet it wasn't about ownership. It was about restoration. I spent weeks scrubbing the walls, peeling away the moldy wallpaper, resealing the windows. I painted the small studio room in soft blues and warm cedar. Every board I sanded down felt like brushing memory back to life. The front steps stopped creaking. The windows finally opened without screaming. By the start of October, I hung a wooden sign above the porch carved by hand. The Willow Retreat for those who held everything together. We opened quietly. No ribbon cutting, no launch party, just a coffee pot, some warm bread, and an unlocked door. Our first guest was a retired hospice nurse named Lorraine 68 Gray Braid. Hands like poetry, in motion. She said she hadn't painted in 10 years. "I didn't stop because I didn't love it," she told me. "I just got used to putting everyone else first." I handed her a brush. "There's space here now." The second guest was a soft-spoken man named Carter. Former Army medic, hadn't spoken to his own son in over a decade. He brought a duffel bag, a broken harmonica, and silence that stretched for miles. By day 3, he was humming again. Each guest left a mark, not just in paint or music or words, but in the way the house began to fill with something new. Not noise, not performance. Peace. And in that quiet I healed too. I wasn't the girl clutching documents anymore. I wasn't the one staring down betrayals. I was just caretaker of forgotten spaces, witness to soft resurrections. Then one afternoon in November, a new arrival knocked at the door. Her name was Edith 81, former portrait artist. Her eyes sparkled like weathered glass. She walked in with a cane and a canvas roll tucked under her arm. "I don't have anything to prove," she said, settling into the chair by the window. "I just want to remember what it felt like to see someone and draw them." I brought her tea, folded an old wool blanket over her knees, and left her by the window as the lake rippled in silver light. For days she barely spoke. She only sketched tiny swirls, shadow work, light pencil strokes that seemed to dance before you even saw the full form. Then one morning, I found her standing by the hearth holding a cloth-covered canvas in both hands. "This is for you," she said softly. I blinked. "Me," she nodded. "I drew it from memory, from how you feel in a room, not how you look." I sat down, hands trembling slightly, and lifted the cloth. The portrait wasn't perfect. It wasn't airbrushed or posed or idealized, but it was the most honest version of myself I had ever seen. Eyes steady, jaw set, shoulders squared, not with tension but with quiet knowing. And around the edges, small brush strokes, shaped like willow branches, curled inward like arms cradling something precious. "I didn't know I looked like that," I whispered. Edith smiled. "That's because you've only ever seen yourself through people who needed you." "Small," I cried. Not loudly, not bitterly. Just enough to feel something loosen in my chest that had been there for years. I hung the painting in the studio hallway, right above the corkboard where guests pinned their own mementos. Polaroids, thank you notes, broken buttons, little scraps of remembered life. Next to it, I tacked a small card with Grandpa's handwriting, something I found tucked in one of his old woodworking books. It read, "Don't build monuments to grief. Build doors for the living." That's what the lake house had become. Not a victory lap, not a shrine, but a door. A space where people who had been forgotten by others could remember themselves again. And somehow, through their restoration, I found mine. At night, when the lake turned glassy and the trees whispered like they knew old secrets, I would sit on the porch with a mug of tea and watch the lights flicker in the studio. Paint music, laughter, silence, all welcome. No one asked for credentials, no one compared pain. We just shared breath and space and softness, and over time the questions that once haunted me stopped clawing at my sleep. Why didn't they love me? Why did they erase me? Why did I keep showing up? They didn't matter anymore, because the answer was here in brushstrokes, in cracked tea mugs, in the smile Grandpa gave me that last night when he whispered, "You built what I only dreamed of." I didn't just survive my family's erasure. I redrew the outline and I filled it with light. I